So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi. I'll serve as the host for the seminar. As a reminder, we are meeting both here in person and on Zoom, and appreciate everyone joining us, whether it's here for lunch and conversation or able to reach us via Zoom. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce Unruh Cohen to be with us here today for the seminar. Anna is the Senior Director for NEPA, Infrastructure and Clean Energy at the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House, also known as the Senior Director for NICE.
So we're the NICE team.
The NICE team, that is the acronym with an acronym within it, where she is in the government. Anna, before joining the Council on Environmental Quality, has extensive experience having worked on Capitol Hill. She served as the staff director for the House of Representatives Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, deputy staff director for the House Natural Resources Committee, deputy staff director for the House Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming, which I think is when we first met, back when climate policy seemed a little different. We've aged since then.
We have a few more gray hairs than we did back then, Joe.
Well, I don't know. I also have fewer hairs. And also served in the Senate for Senator Markey as the director for Energy, Climate, and Natural Resources Forum. Anna also served as the managing director of government affairs at the Natural Resources Defense Council. She holds a PhD in earth sciences from the University of Oxford. It's great to have you joining us here today. Anna will make a presentation and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Anna, welcome to the seminar.
Thanks, Joe. Great to be here. As you heard, my educational background is in climate science, and I got my start in DC in the fall of 2001, working for then Congressman Ed Markey. And of the years I've spent in DC, 13 or so have been, we're working with Ed Markey in both the House and the Senate, and it was always great to be able to call up the smart people at Harvard to ask them to help me with problems that we were dealing with, or just help me better understand things. So it's great to be here. Hopefully I'll make you all a little smarter by the end of the seminar, but just looking forward to the conversation and what I've got to tell you here today. So as Joe mentioned, we met a while ago when Congress was first making a push on climate legislation back in 2009 and 2010. We got it through the House, but not through the Senate. And we've been plugging away ever since. Luckily, many things came together in the recent years to lead to really a suite of historic climate and clean energy laws. The first one I have on here often gets lost. It was the end of 2020. We were 8 months into the pandemic. There was a lot of things going on, but there was actually really important environmental and energy legislation that passed as part of that omnibus, including basically the implementation aspects of the Kigali Agreement that goes to hydrofluorocarbons, as well as authorizing a bunch of programs that then were appropriated resources in the infrastructure law. So it's not one that gets usually put in this suite of laws, but it is a really important one, and I don't want it to get lost, especially because it was a bipartisan effort as well. But a lot of the action was just in the last Congress, and we had the infrastructure law, CHIPS and Science Act, which has some important aspects for semiconductors that go into clean energy. And then finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, which definitely a highlight of my career to be on the House floor as they were taking that final vote, which is what this picture is. If you've ever visited the House chamber, there's sort of electronic ways to indicate votes. So that was the final tally with all 220 Democrats voting for it. And now that I no longer work in the House, I can show you that because I shouldn't have been taking pictures on the House floor. But so that was great. Big important steps. But now we've turned to the aspect of implementing it all. And so just, I could have probably 10 slides on the status of things right now, but to just, highlight a few since since the year since the IRA became law, we've already moved out $70 billion in grants, rebates, and other funding, launched more than half of the grant programs created. EPA alone has moved $650 million in funding for environmental justice projects. And we've already seen the economic development that's happening from that. Tons of announcements across the country about manufacturing, expanding other types of things. I think one of the things is it's great. We're already seeing all that much, and just there's more to come since we are only sort of halfway through pushing out the funding and investments that are in the IRA. There's still a number of important tax credits and incentives that I know folks are waiting on guidance from Treasury for, that I think will drive to even further deployment of clean energy. And, it's not just the Inflation Reduction Act. The infrastructure law had funding for battery programs, energy efficiency, conservation block programs, grid resilience, over at the Department of Energy and at the Department of Interior, really important funding for cleaning up abandoned mines and wells. And like I said, I could go on, but you get the picture. You've probably been reading the news. The key, we're very focused on implementation now. And you may have heard some in the administration saying, the focus is to deploy. And that's absolutely what we need to do to meet the targets and cut carbon pollution that we need to achieve here in the next decade. But there are a lot of pieces that go in to being able to deploy that. So we have financing, both public and private. We have the workforce to actually build the stuff. We have supply chain issues to make sure we have the stuff to build. Lots of puzzle pieces have to come together to succeed in deploying. So for a long time, our legislative focus has been kind of on that financing investment piece. Is the federal government going to invest? Are they going to set up a new regulatory structure that will drive private investment to change the way they're doing things? So with those suite of laws, we've sort of overcome that financing piece, which has meant the spotlight is now on these other pieces of the puzzle. And workforce and supply chain, definitely a lot of challenging things there, a lot of things the administration is doing. But my job is to focus on permitting. And so that is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. Because I came to CEQ with the goal of helping to make permitting more effective and efficient. And you'll hear me use those terms a lot in the talk. And I really mean those two together because we do want and need in some cases to speed up timeframes. We can't do that at the cost of communities or the environment that are impacted by building this infrastructure. So just quickly, as part of those suite of laws and other actions, there's already been a focus on permitting reform. So the bipartisan infrastructure law had a few things. That was passed in November of 2021. In May of 2022, the Biden-Harris administration put out this permitting action plan to recognizing now that we had some of these infrastructure investments flowing, we really need to focus on the permitting side of things. So you can see some of the key aspects there of how the plan was to accelerate things. Then the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and there's a lot in there. I won't fault you for not knowing, but hopefully you know there was nearly $1 billion that went into across the government to funding permitting activities. So more capacity at the staff level. I think innovative tools, some new digital technology. And all of my time in Congress, when I was defending NEPA, if you look at what was really challenges to permitting in the federal agencies, and especially to NEPA, it was resources. It was just having the actual people in the agencies to do the work in large part. So really, for the first time in all of my years in DC, we have, the type of resources that we need going into permitting. And so the challenge to us is, all right, we have the resources. Let's get going. But it's not just NEPA. I know NEPA sometimes gets the headlines and the focus, but there are a range of processes, other permits that often infrastructure projects need. Here's just one example from the Department of Interior data for the Bureau of Land Management mine permitting. So you can see here in the various categories of environmental reviews, NEPA is just one aspect of the time it takes to get from sort of a proposal for a mine to ready to go on the mine. And so, that as we talk about, when you hear someone talk about NEPA and maybe complaining about NEPA, you definitely have to dig in a little bit more to really understand what all is needed for a project to get started. So my goal here is to shine a little light on NEPA. It was really forward thinking in 1969, which was before I was born. And we have all of the decades of experience since then. And I'm going to try, my goal here is to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that really is essential for the 21st century and what all we need to accomplish. So just to set sense, most of us were not alive in the 60s, just a reminder of some of the environmental impacts that our nation was facing. And they were pretty tangible. You could see the air was dirty. You could see you didn't want to go in the Charles. We had lots of stories about wildlife impacts. And so this was kind of the situation as Congress really put together this innovative law. It is not very long. It was about 7 pages. Now it's about 12 after the amendments from the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And I really would encourage you to read it if you haven't. I am a NEPA nerd enough that on my first day going to the White House, while I was on the Metro, I reread the law. And it took, my Metro ride is not that long. It's about 15 minutes. So you all can read it and should read it. Because it's important and I would argue inspiring. But just the basics: signed into law in 1970 on January 1st by President Nixon. It was the first substantial amendments really just happened in June as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And NEPA, which stands for, maybe I didn't say it, the National Environmental Policy Act, also created CEQ. So the place I work now exists because of that law. And then in addition to what CEQ does, every agency has their own NEPA procedures and processes that are consistent with the regulations we put out. So just, again, encouraging you to read it. Some of the language in the purpose section is really far-reaching, that Congress recognizes that each person should enjoy a healthful environment and that each person has a responsibility to contribute to the preservation and enhancement of the environment. So right from the beginning, Congress envisioned the protection of aspects of the human environment for the continued use and enjoyment of future generations. And I think especially now with our focus on environmental justice, this part is really important. But there was more than that. There's, the key principles of NEPA are summarized here. It's interdisciplinary review, as well as looking at alternatives to federal action, really incorporating scientific information and the coordination and collaboration, ideally, with other federal agencies, tribal, state, and local governments, and importantly, public transparency. So those key principles informed the law when it was created and continue to this day. There have been various times along the past where there have been sort of reevaluations of NEPA. So there was a big one in the mid-90s when it turned 25. And again, these key aspects of it came through. So the planning part, public input, coordination, interdisciplinary work, and a scientific approach. And all along, NEPA and CEQ has put together various aspects of guidance to help things. I forgot to pull out my prop. I have a citizen's guide to NEPA with me, but that is out there if you need some help, as well as just really a whole host of things, including guidance on how to integrate climate change and greenhouse gases, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. Just a quick flow chart of what happens when a project that needs to undergo a NEPA review is proposed. So there are sort of 3 levels of review. The one you've probably heard the most about is an environmental impact statement. And so if there's going to be significant environmental impact, you say yes, and then you go through your EIS process. If you're not sure, you end up in this middle place where there's an environmental assessment. And depending on what you find as part of that assessment, you may, if there's significant impacts, end up overdoing an EIS. If there are not significant impacts, then you do what's called an environmental assessment. And then over here, closest to me, is something called categorical exclusions, which does not mean they're excluded from NEPA. It's actually a category of actions that are excluded from having to do an environmental impact statement. And I know sometimes that is confusing to people. They hear that term categorical exclusions used and they think, oh, there's not going to be an environmental review. But that's not accurate, because to qualify for these, the agency has to determine what's happening is not going to have the significant impact, and an existing categorical exclusion that they've already shown works can be applied here. So just want to level set so everybody here is working on their being a NEPA nerd. But it's also important to think of those three categories when we think about timelines. So actually, from a study done back in 2014 by the Government Accountability Office, most federal actions are actually categorical exclusions. And as you can see over in the chart from a paper looking at Forest Service data, those categorical exclusions, that's that big spike. They happen relatively quickly. Then the environmental assessments are around 5% of federal action. They take a little bit longer time, that they're that sort of second hump there. And then you have the environmental impact statements, which you can see most of them take a little bit longer, but you do get that tail going out there, which leads to some of the more nightmare scenarios that we hear about environmental permitting.
What's the units on the horizontal?
Those are months. So, yeah. Days? Oh, sorry, they're days. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, they're days. Sorry. I think there's another one coming up that's months. Sorry. Yeah. So just to dig into the EIS data a little bit more, and this is from a CEQ report that was done in 2020. It has this average 4.5 years for an EIS that you may have heard in news articles. Again, it's just for EISs, which are just that sort of 1% or less than 1% of environmental reviews. And that is the average, although the median here is a little sooner than that. And it's this long tail that kind of gets the headlines. When you dig into those individual ones, usually they're all their own sort of unique story and have some really challenging aspect to them. One we were just talking about in the office was a road that was being built through a Superfund site. So the EIS got started and then kind of just put on the shelf while they were dealing with the Superfund issue. And then they came back around to the EIS to finally build the road. So that leads to a really long time period, but for a fairly reasonable decision. But still, these very complex projects are some of the key ones for our clean energy build out. And so, we do need to find ways to make sure that we're moving through this environmental assessment as efficiently as we can. CEQ became law in 1970. CEQ issued regulations for NEPA. NEPA became law in 1970, issued regulations in 1978, and those set of regulations have largely been in place for 40 years. And then in 2020, there was a big revamp of that rule. Part of it incorporated sort of the however many years of agency practice, case law, those type of things. There were also some things inserted that were legally questionable, I think is what my lawyers advised me to say, because we are in a lawsuit over some of those, over that rule. But the Biden administration came in, said we're going to take a look at it, and so did an initial sort of targeted revamp, changing 3 key things in the regulations. And then we've just been undergoing another kind of revamp of everything, which was just released at the end of July. Public comment period closed at the end of September. And I will go into a few more of those things. So the phase 1 rulemaking, these were kind of the 3 key things that were changed there. Restoring the direct, indirect, and cumulative into the definition of effects was really probably the major one and is really important for environmental justice work in particular. In addition to the two-phase work on the underlying regulations, CEQ also updated climate change guidance. So in January of this year, they issued interim guidance. So it's in effect, agencies are implementing it. We had a public comment period. We're looking through those pieces, and we look forward to finalizing that guidance in the new year. And the two kind of key things here are in looking at the impacts of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and how you could reduce those in the proposed actions, as well as the effects of climate change on a proposed action. So, and all of this as well as what I'm talking about, both for phase 1 and phase 2, are on NEPA.gov. So as I go through here quickly, all of that is there. But 2 weeks into my new job at CEQ, being in charge of NEPA, Congress amended the law, as I mentioned. So we have been taking that on, working with agencies to implement those changes, as well as incorporating them into the proposed rule we put out. Here are some of the changes from the law. Some of the key things are timelines. So now agencies are really supposed to get their EISs done within 2 years, which if you flash back to that slide, you know, that will be challenging. Environmental assessments, 1 year. There's some page limits, some other clarifications on things. Much of this was in the regulations. And so by putting it in the statute, sort of reinforcing that that is really what agencies and departments need to accomplish in their NEPA review. Here's just some more of the things that the Fiscal Responsibility Act did. And the one I want to hone into here, let's see, is this third bullet. It's section 109 if you're happen to be looking at the law, but it's a way for agencies to adopt other agencies' categorical exclusions. And so since those sort of help us get through the environmental review more quickly, you know, I think we see this as a way that will help speed up some of that environmental review. And we've already seen, agencies were pretty excited about this. We've already seen, it was, I guess, mid-September, we saw the first use of those, and that was the Department of Transportation adopting the Department of Energy's categorical exclusion for EV infrastructure, which will be really important. You probably know that between the infrastructure law and the IRA, there's a lot of money to build out EV charging infrastructure. Those two agencies are actually working together. Now they both have a categorical exclusion to share. So if you're building a charger in like a parking lot, you know, an agency can do, if they're funding build out in a place that was already built up, we'll be able to move through that environmental review quickly. There's a lot of interest in that from actually other agencies adopting that CE. We've also seen some adoption of a solar CE. So we're seeing good things happening out of that new provision. As I mentioned, we put out a proposed rule for phase 2. And again, that's on NEPA.gov. You want to check it out. In the rule, we needed to fully implement the Fiscal Responsibility Act amendments, as well as, again, really try and find ways to have efficient and effective environmental review processes that really continues to have meaningful public engagement and is promoting regulatory certainty is our goal. And as I said, the comment period has closed. We're looking at those comments now, working to finalize a rule hopefully early next year. A couple of the things in that rule, there are climate change related pieces in addition to the guidance I mentioned previously, so that where agencies are looking at climate effects, as they're looking at their alternatives, they're looking at a broader timeline. So for an action, the example I've been using is like if you're building a solar farm on federal land, in the near term, you'll have some environmental impact from that construction. You're going to disturb the land, you're going to have some pollution maybe from the diesel generator that you have there as you're building something. But if you look at the long term, that solar farm, once it's built, is going to be putting clean electrons onto the grid. And so we're encouraging agencies to look at that longer time frame as they're evaluating what level of environmental review projects need to undergo. And just some other encouragement for programmatic environmental assessments, which can help sort of set the stage for general type of work. And then when a developer comes with their specific project, it doesn't take as long to get through the full review. And then on the climate adaptation and resilience side, requiring EISs to look at those issues as well. Public engagement is a really big piece of the proposed rule and is a really big piece of the success, both for NEPA, but permitting in general. So NEPA was really ahead of its time in promoting public involvement and transparency. I actually argue that it is a small d one of our key small d democratic laws, because without it, you don't know what the government is doing in your backyard. And it was really sort of revolutionary approach, and it's now been replicated across countries and states and localities because of that way to involve the public and help them understand what is going to happen. So in the rule, we really are leaning into public engagement, and here are some of the ways on this slide, and two on this slide I really want to emphasize is the idea of having a chief public engagement officer at agencies. So somebody whose responsibility within the agency is to really focus on what are we doing on engagement, how do we make it successful. And so at the moment they're falling out of NEPA. There are chief environmental officers basically for environmental permitting officers in all the agencies. I happen to be that what's called the SERPO for CEQ. And so, our hope is to replicate sort of that sort of focus with a person wearing that chief public engagement officer hat. The other one is this top bullet, which I, was surprised to learn when I came into CEQ, that sometimes, projects often, different agencies have different pieces of them, and sometimes different agencies call the same project different things. So, which is complicated and makes it hard sometimes for the public to follow what's happening, makes it hard for agencies to figure out what's happening. So one of the proposals in the rule is everybody has to call the project the same thing. Oh wait, maybe that was on the other slide. But everybody has to call the same thing, identify it the same way. And I think that is just sounds pretty basic, but actually will help coordination efforts across the government. And you don't have to take just my word for it. On the public engagement side of things, two relatively recent reports from two groups that have pretty different views on their approach to climate. One is the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, They had a report out in June, just after we passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which they said, was helpful, but policymakers needed to look at doing more. And the number one thing on their list was dealing with time period for public comment. And I think importantly, this statement about working with local stakeholders to reduce litigation risk in the future. And then more recently, in September, the Center for American Progress put out a report looking at a case study of some infrastructure that had been permitted and moved forward. And their first key takeaway is this early and effective engagement with all stakeholders is really what is important. And it's not easy. Every project is different. Every sort of engagement approach can be ultimately is different. There are some best practices, but it is really the piece that we need to lean into. And just like small d democracy, it's hard. It can be hard, and people need to have to work with each other and listen to each other. But it is really what we need to encourage. And my last kind of topic here that we also are really trying to focus on, both overall in the Biden-Harris administration, but also in our proposed rule, is the environmental justice piece. If you recall, my first kind of slides on NEPA, honed in on, right from the start, the law is underscoring the need for Americans to live in safe and healthful surroundings. And so, we think that just follows through all of the environmental justice work. But then earlier this year, President Biden signed a new executive order on environmental justice, which has specific language on the consideration of environmental justice and NEPA reviews that we have also incorporated into our proposed rule. And so I just have a couple of slides to mostly close out about some of those pieces. One important one is as agencies are developing alternatives, to look at how those alternatives may impact health and environmental effects on communities with environmental justice concerns. And looking at when they assess the significance of the effects, that they are looking at the impact on environmental justice communities, as well as especially and in addition, tribal nations and other related tribal concerns. And here are just a few more of the things in the proposed rule that we're doing for environmental justice. And especially in the definitions, whenever you're looking at legislation, definitely look at the definitions section. A lot of important things happen there. Don't miss that. And so here also the definitions that we're updating include a lot of important things for environmental justice. So as I wrap up, we started in the 60s, real tangible environmental impacts. Many of them are still with us. Thankfully, you can spend some more time in the Charles these days, but probably still a little more work to do there, as I recall. But we've moved on to adding even additional environmental concerns now, whether it's greenhouse gases, the impacts of climate change, and environmental justice. And I think NEPA has been critical with dealing with those issues for the last 50 years and will be critical for us to ensure that Americans 50 years from now will be able to thrive. And so that's what I'm doing and what our team is trying to do across the government as we work to make NEPA implementation more efficient and effective. So thanks.
Great. So I'll start off the Q&A period. You'd identified a couple of objectives here about improving environmental outcomes, ensuring a meaningful process and enhancing transparency. As we're moving forward with these kinds of reforms, how do we go about assessing the effectiveness of the reforms? How do we evaluate the performance? Because NEPA is different than other environmental laws. It doesn't actually establish environmental standards like we see in the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act. It's basically requires a process and requires us to sort of shine light where we think there's risk. And once we do initial work, we may do additional study. How do we evaluate these reforms to say this is helping ensure a cleaner environment? How do we assess changes in the process to say this is sufficient process or more meaningful process so that we feel like we're doing people right when we think about their role in democracy and in informing this process?
All right. Trust the economists to ask about how we measure effectiveness. So no, it's a great question, Joe. Well, and one of the things to start with is also just capturing the data of what we're doing. So one of the slides I showed with the time frame for categorical exclusions, that's based on Forest Service data, because they're one of the few agencies that keep track of every categorical exclusion that they do. There actually is just a new paper out in Nature Sustainability that I just got on like Friday. So I didn't incorporate it into my talk, looking again at this Forest Service data that shows, the EIS piece, regardless of what of the three categories you go through, it still takes a little over a year to get started on a forest program. So it isn't just necessarily, again, the NEPA piece. But that's one of the underlying things is just we need to better understand the data all across the agencies. And we are trying to do some of that. We're trying to update the 2020 EIS report too. We're looking at the latest because that just went to 2018. So we're trying to add in those things. So I think there's some of that just tracking what agencies are doing and what they're applying, especially in our proposed rule. We are trying to see develop more categorical exclusions, more programmatic environmental assessments. So we want to see, are agencies actually using that? Is that sort of shrinking the time frame for the NEPA reviews, and are we having success there? Now, it's harder to assess the benefit to communities piece. And I think one probably not very, not the best variable is looking at the litigation side of things. Unfortunately, it's not the cleanest data because there's lots of motivations for people bringing lawsuits. But I think there is probably going to be a little more qualitative in that respect, because we, just will mean communities being satisfied with what's happening. And one of the keys to now that we're under these sort of 2-year and 1-year timeframes is we actually need agencies, project developers, and communities like ready at the start of that clock. So I think you actually will see more prescription from agencies about things developers need to bring to them at the start of a project. So we've seen that for offshore wind. BOEM now has a checklist of things like, these are the things we need you to bring to us before we can, really set a schedule. So I look forward to the smart people at Harvard thinking of ways that we can better measure that effectiveness.
Great, thank you. Let me open it up for questions from the audience.
I've got some in the back there.
Niels Handler, visiting PhD fellow at MIT Sloan. Similar to Joe Aldi's question, I was wondering sort of, what do novel sort of evidence and rigorous evaluation play in the design and implementation of these policies? sort of, from what I understand, for the NEPA policies, there's always like an ex-ante evaluation required, like the impact evaluations. I would assume that's done through like cost-benefit analysis or theoretical modeling or so. Like, do ex-post evaluations, especially with like rigorous methods, is that
Yeah.
gaining traction at the moment? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Cost-benefit analysis is not required as part of NEPA reviews. Some agencies do that. Some projects, kind of better lend themselves to that. It can be challenging to have ways to compare things across alternatives. But that, in a way, sort of is one reason we end up relying on the years of experience. And so for categorical exclusions, in order to put a new one into effect, the agency has to substantiate that what they want to, the actions they want to put in there, that, they've done in past environmental assessments, environmental impact statements, like they've seen these projects, in existence for however many time, and really prove or build a strong case that it will not have large impacts. And so, there's a little, as you probably know, I mean, it is hard to sometimes have real concrete metrics when we're talking about environmental impacts. So there's both, if there can be quantitative things for the project, those agencies will include those. But a lot of it is also a qualitative evaluation. As part of the greenhouse gas guidance, agencies also can use the social cost of greenhouse gases, if it makes sense for the project that they're approaching to use those things. And sometimes, that can help say, well, this alternative will have, really minimal climate costs, whereas, another way forward may have more. So it's challenging, which I'm sure you're probably finding in your studies as well. But the CEQ regulations don't require a specific sort of cost-benefit analysis or metric along those lines. And there was another question over here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Very interesting. My name's Yasmina. I'm an MPP1. I'm curious if you can tell us a bit more about how the implementation planning, what the implementation planning was, and then the actual rollout of these changes that you mentioned, the 3 phases, maybe focusing on the one that you were present for, the most recent one. Just because, as you said, a lot of these changes, for example, kind of thinking about long-term impact, balancing that out with short-term harms, really curious how you kind of trickled that through the agencies and made sure that's being done now.
Yeah, so one thing just to clarify, which I probably didn't, is CEQ, as we write our NEPA regulations, they're ones that have to go across all the government, and then each agency does their own NEPA process. So then you have like a next level of NEPA procedures and processes. It sort of depends from agency to agency how they're doing it. So we're finalizing these, and then there will be subsequent work by agencies to update their procedures. Now and we're trying to do some of that in tandem. We obviously, the agencies can't finalize their procedures until we have finalized ours. But we're hoping to work with a few key ones, just so we also can better navigate some of the challenges agencies may face in implementing the regulations. So in our proposed rule, it does say within a year. from being finalized. Agencies will have to update their procedures, but we're hoping to work with a few places so that once we finalize, we can have a couple of places that have updated their procedures pretty soon thereafter, so that it becomes part of what agencies are doing. So, and again, just, back for the 2020 rule, and a lot of it carried through to our proposed rule, a lot of the updates were just agencies have been doing NEPA for 40 years. There's a lot of case law from various litigation. And so a lot of that update in 2020 that then has carried through is just putting into regulations that experience and that direction from the courts, frankly, into regulations. So let's see, we had a couple up here. Oh, we got one student back there with okay.
Tyler Engler, MPP1. Thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask about the interagency collaboration process. Can you talk a little bit about some of the changes with the new rules and what's you've seen work really effectively in coordination between the departments? And then if there's anything else that you think still needs to be overcome.
Yeah, well, one thing we are proposing that I think will be helpful is, it was right up front here, Liz, right, yeah, is for agencies to be able to develop joint categorical exclusions. And this one in particular, I think out west, where we're trying to build transmission lines that sort of cross first Bureau of Land Management and then go into Forest Service, that type of thing. And for them to be able to do some of that work together. So, a transmission line gets this part built, but then has to wait for the next agency. So hopefully that will speed up some of the things. The other key part about NEPA, I said in the beginning, NEPA is not the only federal permitting piece, but it often is the umbrella and the mechanism that agencies use to coordinate and collaborate. So, the lead agency working on a NEPA review, maybe they also have to do an environment or a endangered species consultation and involve like the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so as part of building their sort of NEPA plan, they will incorporate that. And so, that just NEPA in itself kind of forces that collaboration and timing. And we really, part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act amendments, and so therefore carried on into the regulations, or is the idea of having a lead agency. So somebody is sort of in charge and can wrangle everybody together and make sure that there's a schedule to, again, meet these, what will be in some cases challenging timeframes, so that everybody knows when they can, when they need to be working on something to achieve that goal. And since they all are calling it the same thing, hopefully that will be a little bit easier too. So.
What a great talk. Okay. Great talk. Learned so much. The government is very lucky to have you. My name is Leah Stokes. I'm a fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Nice to see you. My question is about the New York City congestion pricing case, which is one of those in your long tail in some ways. And it's not necessarily about the particulars of that case, but it started in 2019 and they just finalized it this year. So you could say, yeah, the Trump administration was part of the reason for the delay, but the Biden administration is also a part of the reason that it took that long. And I'm just curious, especially with a policy like that, that is hypothetically supposed to do good things for the climate. Do you feel like the new rules are going to make that kind of an outcome less likely? And do you do assessments at all of these like really bad outcomes where you're like, what went wrong in that case and how could we think about not doing that when you're, for example, finalizing these rules? Or how do you kind of integrate learning into the process so that these sorts of outcomes don't happen as frequently? I'm just curious to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, and I really don't know the particulars of the New York congestion case, so I probably will set that aside. But again, as I said, each of these really long ones, often have their own unique story. And I do think agencies tend to try and assess what's going on to the extent that they could. Again, until very recently, like the resources that agencies had for this type of work was always fairly limited. And so then, your focus is on what I need to do to move the current projects on my desk forward, not necessarily can I take the time to look at what we're doing. As I mentioned, we are trying to look at the latest years of data for EISs since 2018. And I think probably as part of that work, we will maybe try and dig into understanding some of what was taking these longer ones. I mean, we just sort of anecdotally did it in the office the other day, which is why this Superfund and road thing came up. I think there also is a lot of work outside of the government looking at those things. The CAP report, which I think actually, Carrie, there was part of, I'm going to mess up your acronym, Energy and Environmental Law Program was part of that work. So that is, I mean, if people are looking for things to do, actually helping us understand what has gone wrong or has made things take long is important. One of the case studies that was in that report was actually the SunZia transmission line, which has been in the news a lot. Now, it is a project that crossed 4 states, 14 counties, and wildlife refuge, those type of things. So, it was a big, complex thing. And again, the final piece to get it done was really, in the end, some willingness to collaborate with stakeholders, shift where it was going. And actually it went on the Fast 41 dashboard, which I think helped focus things as well. But again, I really cannot underscore enough that working with stakeholders, working with the states and tribes is just really critical to success. One thing I didn't mention is another piece often is the historic Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which often also is another piece in permitting, and the chair of the advisory committee for that, Sarah Boland, is really has recognized also this challenge and is trying to move forward to ensure that we're able to do the important preservation work that we need to do, but again, do it in an efficient manner.
I have 2 quick questions. The first is that if you look at the energy transition, trying to get to net zero over the next basically 26 years, you're going to be looking at thousands of energy projects, which is going to put tremendous burden on the capacity of the government to review all of these.
Yep.
Is that recognized, and are you taking action to start to prepare to have the capability to handle all of this? And the second one is the question of meaningful engagement. In my experience, in the times I've been in government, most of the people at hearings that I conducted were paid to be there. And they were the same people every time. If you're going to go to low-income neighborhoods, if you're trying to engage this whole environmental justice, how do you get people who are having 2 jobs, have no extra time, have no money, and to show up and meaningful participate in these type of engagement?
Yeah. Two great questions. The first one allows me to say something I forgot to say, which is permitting jobs or climate jobs. So for you young people who are looking for ways to get involved with climate, do not forget the opportunities that there are in permitting. We need all types. You need archaeologists, you need biologists, you need lawyers. So
You need
keep the
MPPs.
yeah, I'm sure we do. Actually, we have a number of folks on our team who have MPAs as well. So keep that in mind. But part of the motivation, putting my former congressional staffer hat on, part of the motivation for the money that we had in the Inflation Reduction Act for permitting was recognizing we are going to need these resources. You know, we're funding things there for 10-year times. We need for 10 years. We need to make sure that agencies have that. Now, luckily, a lot of some of those projects may not touch that we need to get to net zero, may actually be non-federal projects or other things that don't then trigger NEPA. There are obviously state and local issues to overcome potentially sometimes as well, but not all of what we build will necessarily be NEPA. But I mean, I think people are increasingly understanding we have to make this investment in permitting. And so hopefully we'll see that continue. Environmental justice question, great question. And also a hard one to answer other than with a lot of hard work. Part of what we have in the proposed rule are taking the best practices from agencies across the federal government where they have had success in putting those into the CEQ regulations so that then those will flow to other agencies. Many of the investments in the Inflation Reduction Act do go to capacity building. So there's a lot in the environmental justice space. One that I was involved with is focused on transmission for state and local funding of capacity, just so people can start to develop the technical expertise and do some of the other things that are needed so that communities can engage meaningfully as these infrastructure projects are happening. I think increasingly NGOs are recognizing this is a place that they can be helpful, at least to sort of informing a community and again, kind of supporting their capacity to be able to engage. But it is challenging. And, you know, I have gone to public meetings about my daughter's high school expansion and the new train tunnel coming through our park in the heart of Capitol Hill. So, you know, it does, you know, it is, again, going back to that, it's really part of small d democratic engagement. That can be hard for many, many people in our society. And so we just need to focus on ways we can make that easier. One of the slides, you know, said, I mean, language can often be a barrier. So we want to make sure agencies are getting their announcements out in the languages that make sense for their communities, and finding other sort of innovative ways to get the word out.
We've got time for one more.
Okay, I'll try and be a quick answer too.
God, I think I had a complicated question. Charles Taylor, assistant professor here. You know, you said not all projects are NEPA, right? I mean, in theory, these are federal projects, and the definition of what's you know, has a touch to a federal project is has there been discussions about either limiting that in certain kind of strategic renewable energy type projects to reduce both the burden on you all as well as some of the permitting requirements of, anyone who gets IRA money, is that a federal project, right? I mean, kind of how do you think about that line and where it's drawn?
Sorry, I'm messing with my microphone there. So, NEPA is really focuses on helping people understand what's happening around them based from federal government action. So, I don't, in a way, we want everybody to know what's happening around them. It's hard to pick and choose and limit those ideas. If, it's the National Environmental Policy Act, but I often say it's the Need to Engage the People Act. And hopefully it just would be a challenge for the fundamental focus of NEPA to really limit it to specific categories. Now, it does only apply to major federal actions, and that actually was part of what there were some changes to that as part of the amendments. Again, it was a situation where a lot of that new language in the statute was pretty similar to things that were already in the regulations. And so that is underscored, but we're definitely, I think people are really taking a hard look at, especially given that new language, what that's going to mean, which projects will continue to require NEPA based on that. I think to the point of the importance of build out of clean energy and taking climate change into effect, the regulations encouragement to look at that longer time span and what a project is really the benefit, the impacts and benefits that are going to come over that longer time frame, I think is a way that is going to help accelerate projects that are addressing climate challenges, move through the environmental review more quickly. So I think, that is kind of our best way to really focus people on infrastructure that can best help us for climate while maintaining that integrity of having communities be able to know what government actions are impacting in their neighborhoods.
So before we wrap up, let me note that we will meet again at noon this coming Monday. Jason Grumet, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Clean Power Association, will be joining us. Jason may have a few thoughts on permitting.
Yeah, I was going to say, you'll definitely want to come back for that talk.
And finally, please join me in thanking Unruh Cohen for her presentation today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff.